This is Hannah Brown interviewing Sebastian HW on the 17th of September 2017 at his dad's home in Moseley. Sebastian was born in 1989 in Guadalajara, Mexico. Sebastian migrated to Birmingham in 1996. Can you tell me about your family background?
Yeah, sure. So my dad is Mexican. My dad's from the southern bit of Mexico. It's called Yucatan, which is actually nowhere near Guadalajara. And my mum's from Bilston in Wolverhampton. And like her family have always lived in that kind of South Shropshire part. But she's never really lived in Birmingham until we moved here. My dad had never really moved out of Yucatan until he met my mum, when my mum met him in Yucatan. Yeah.
And can you paint me a picture of some of your earliest childhood memories?
Yeah. Well, most of my memories are in Mexico. I've been born there, and we kind of moved to I kind of came to the UK a lot. Like in the summer, not the winter, the summer periods. And in Mexico, I remember it being obviously it was kind of quite temperate. Kind of this part of Guadalajara is not, it never gets that hot, so I didn't know kind of very tropical, very kind of dry Mexico. But I remember playing a lot in the street with my friends. I had to have a lot of friends back in Mexico, and I was very much quite a happy-go-lucky, outgoing kind of boy. And lots of food. And kind of the food in Mexico is something that kind of really stays with you when you move to the UK, and you think like, oh yeah, actually English food is a little bit kind of quite simple in terms of flavours. Kind of sweets, thinking a lot about kind of confectionery. I just think some of the awful things we must have had, like full of sugar and like all the terrible things in Mexico, but it was great. Pool parties. We had a blow-up pool in the backyard, and that was something that no one else in the street had. So obviously everybody loved me because I had this really awesome thing. Trying to pretend that was something bad. Probably was. Yeah.
Okay. Can you describe your early school experiences?
Yeah. So I don't remember much about the ones in Mexico. I don't remember the names of what they were, but I do remember there's very strong memories that every Monday morning you have to parade the flag, which is a very specific thing you have to do in Mexico, where you have to kind of pledge allegiance and sing the national anthem. You have to wear white, and it's just this really odd kind of pageant towards the kind of nationalism. So that's something I do remember a lot. But then coming to the UK, kind of like was nothing like that, and I kind of expected something like it, but it was the best we got was singing kind of things in assembly. So we moved to Birmingham, and I went to Park Hill, which is kind of a school in Moseley. And yeah, I think I came very, very kind of apprehensive because I didn't know what to expect. I think my memories of England had always just been very kind of during holiday time, just with family, one place, usually my grandparents, and they lived near Wolverhampton in Woomburn. So I was kind of very nervous to think like what was it going to be like throughout the rest of the year in the UK. But actually coming to Park Hill, coming to kind of like inner city Birmingham was great because it was really very, very multicultural, and that's something I think Mexico kind of certainly lacks in some way. I think people are specifically Mexican or kind of a mix of Mexican and Spanish or other Latin American countries. So that was really interesting, kind of like finding out where people had come from and finding that actually other people had all these amazing stories that had come from other places. And I remember playing kind of, I think we used to call it It. I don't know if it's still called It anymore, but tag. But I think I'm really obsessed with running games. And yeah, school assembly. Learning to use a computer, that was quite a strong thing coming to the UK, so having to do IT lessons and like having access to computers. But actually one memory I remember distinctly, you don't get here in the UK, it's actually in the UK is earthquake training. Whereas in Mexico, because we're on a massive fault line, we had to do all this training, getting under your desk, marching outside, standing, doing all these formations. I remember at one point we have like a special alarm that rings when you have that, and just being really terrified because I just thought, like, is this it? But actually nothing happened. And so it's kind of a bit of a shame. You kind of get really excited and kind of nervous, but in the end, we're just standing outside in the playground looking at each other being like, is something meant to happen now? So I've got quite distinct, quite separate memories of the UK and Mexico, yeah.
You migrated to Birmingham in 1996. Why did your family choose to settle in Birmingham?
So when we moved to the UK in 1996, we didn't come straight to Birmingham. We moved around a lot to other different cities. So my mum studied in Bristol, so we stayed a bit in Bristol with some of her friends. I've got family in London. My dad also has friends in Liverpool, so we kind of moved around a lot. And I'm not too sure exactly why we did that. I think it was perhaps trying to get a feel for kind of where we wanted to be. But I think Birmingham made the most sense because it was a big city. So for like employment, for my mum, because my dad would have to retrain, because a lot of his qualifications weren't necessarily that valid here, and then going through the whole process of trying to get a visa, and I think also because it was closest to my grandparents, which I think my mum felt as they were getting older, she should be close enough to be with them, to support them. So I think that's why Birmingham. I've never really kind of quizzed them enough exactly why, but that feels like the most sense out of what has happened. And again, kind of multicultural city. I feel kind of it had opportunity, and that's why we chose it. Yeah.
And what were your first impressions of Birmingham?
It was very cold. It's really cold. Hadn't quite expected it to be this cold. I think it's because Birmingham is slightly higher up, it's like from the sea level. I think it's not compared to other bits of the UK. Very green. I think I was really, really impressed by how green it was. I think Mexico's lacks a lot of green. I think you have to go to really specific parts to get kind of green. But here it kind of just seems to be everywhere. And Birmingham has like loads and loads of trees. I know there's that whole thing of more trees in Paris, but I think I was just very impressed by just it being throughout the year. Didn't matter. It had lots of changes through the seasons, but also really concrete. It was a really odd kind of mixture of kind of this old style housing and then suddenly all these new concrete buildings. Well, they weren't that new, obviously from the 70s, but to me they felt really, really new. So it's this kind of odd juxtaposition of like very natural and then very kind of artificial and man-made, and kind of in a way quite kind of cold and affronting. But yeah, people seem really friendly. I kind of was very happy. People were not kind of shy to tell you what they thought about the city or about where they're from.
What was the migrant community like when you moved to Birmingham?
So I think coming to Birmingham, particularly in the UK at that time, there wasn't a very visible, very big kind of Latin American migrant community. Definitely not in Birmingham. There was in London, but we never really knew them. So coming here, it felt very. I definitely kind of missed having that, but I think because I was so kind of keen to just get kind of integrated into kind of England, knowing that this was where we're going to spend probably the rest of our lives. It was unlikely we were going to move back to Mexico. Felt very definite. That I didn't really mind so much until kind of later on when I started to think like I was losing Spanish, so I was losing a language to be able to talk to. I guess a kind of ability to share that experience was kind of a shame. But it was interesting kind of having kind of windows into other communities from people from other places. That was I found that kind of more interesting rather than feeling that you suddenly kind of being not tied to community, that you felt obligated you kind of were more free to then move and kind of be part of other people's communities. So, and at the same time, kind of also now having becoming more part of the community of my English side, of my mum's side. So that kind of had a whole new shift in thinking about kind of another part of myself that I'd only really kind of visited. I'd only been kind of being part as like a tourist, coming to the UK and having kind of the odd summer here.
What were your experiences of studying in the UK?
So I remember arriving and starting school, and I've been very nervous because I went into year 7, so I didn't start at year one. No, year 7, so year 3. I was 7 when I moved into year 3. So I was worried that I wouldn't make friends very easily because everyone had already made their little friend groups, and I suddenly would be this new kid. But again, that was an assumption that was totally blown out of the water because everyone really, really welcomed me. I remember we had one of my great memories of being at that school was that we were asked to write a book. Year 3, write a book. And I wrote a book called The Leopard Who Had No Spots. And I think I've still got it. I need to find it, actually. And I think it was a story about this leopard who had no spots, but it didn't matter because all the jungle animals still loved him and wanted to be their friend. So I think it was kind of representative of the fact, even though I looked very similar in some ways. I had kind of similar experience. I was still very different, but the difference didn't matter because you were still part of the jungle, the community that was there. So that was great, and then year 6 happens, and then you kind of realise you have to go and study somewhere else, and kind of feeling a lot of those choices again were being made for me. So I think because I was losing Spanish, my parents were really keen that would be a really important skill to have in the future for employability. And also a connection to kind of culture. Like if there's no community here, at least you can connect through language. So they sent me to the Woodrush High School, which it's actually in Bromsgrove. I'm not exactly sure how I got in. I think it was one of those kind of, I think because it's not in the catchment area, so I must have taken some kind of petition or something to get me in there. But it was the only school in the South Birmingham district that taught Spanish at the time. I think I don't know if it's taught more now, but so I was kind of very excited to go and learn that, but I think when I got there I didn't actually quite realise, it became very different because I realised kind of the Spanish was not the Spanish that I was used to. It was just very kind of Castilian, from Spain Spanish, and I think that kind of created a little bit of an identity crisis because my grades were failing, and it was that assumption that I thought that both my parents and I thought that it was going to be this easy GCSE, but actually, it just became this kind of complex nightmare of being retaught something that you thought you already knew. So that was kind of difficult. And then also suddenly going from kind of inner city multicultural Birmingham to kind of very kind of suburban, very kind of pretty much 80-90% white Caucasian. There were very few people of other cultures there, and that was a big shift because suddenly it became more clear that you were something else, that you were other, that you were not not from the local area, that you were from the city. So it was that kind of rural city divide, and the fact that you kind of were this strange mix that I think people could never quite place. So there's kind of a lot, kind of elements of racial aggravation and just generally just the horrors of secondary school. So 5 years of not great stuff. But then going to sixth form, that was great. Coming back to the city, going to Solihull sixth form, and yeah, suddenly I felt like I had more choice. I felt kind of a lot of early education, you just push through it because that's the system. Whereas suddenly when you turn kind of 18, you get this chance where you can start to choose your own subjects and feel you have a sense of ownership of, like I say, destiny, of like more of what you want to do, of where you want to go in your life. So that yeah, that was good. I'm really happy I kind of shifted, because I could have stayed at Woodrush, but there's absolutely no way I was going to do that. Really keen, I wanted to get out, and yeah, start learning something else.
And what were your hobbies and interests outside of school?
So I did, yeah, I don't think what I started. I think I started learning dance. I think I went to a ballet school, and that was good for a while, but then I kind of again found that problematic, because I just thought kind of what ballet dancers were was a very specific kind of body type, and I didn't feel like that was not represented in the kind of the ballet that I saw, and also it just felt more kind of controlling, the way it tried to control the way you moved. So I kind of moved into more contemporary, but I also found that a bit difficult. But around the same time, moved into theatre, and that's when I started to became more interesting, because it was about stories, and I felt I've always been quite related to kind of narratives. So I kind of joined a youth theatre. It's called Stage 2. It's still going, actually, and that was really great, because I felt kind of you just got more involved, I think, in kind of the production of things, the community there of like other people who were learning kind of acting and devising, directing, was, I think, definitely pushed me to think that I wanted a kind of career in the arts, especially in theatre. And because it was different, it was like it was on the weekend, and it wasn't at school time, and nobody from my school went there, so it felt like I could be more of myself, but also somebody else in that kind of space. That wasn't kind of, that wasn't graded. It wasn't kind of necessarily it was being judged in some way, but in a very different way to like being at secondary school. Yeah.
And what happened after secondary school?
So after secondary school, I went to sixth form in Solihull, and that was 2 years. It was quite short, but I felt more that I was making the friendships seem kind of more kind of not say genuine in some way, kind of, but more kind of adult. Like we could talk more about kind of bigger topics in life without feeling that you were kind of being too over intellectual. And I guess people's ambition, you started to see that people knew they wanted to do things with their life, and they wanted to study and go to other places and learn more and question things about themselves. So yeah, I think it was it was really refreshing to suddenly have 2 intensive years that suddenly kind of started to overturn the 5 years of feeling that you were kind of under the thumb constantly from yourself and from the school and teachers. Yeah.
And what happened after sixth form?
Sixth form. So then I went to Darlington College of Arts, which is in Devon. So out of the choices that you made, most of the choices were for university were going to be philosophy courses, because I think I studied philosophy at sixth form, got really interested in that. But at the same time, I met somebody at the school at sixth form who said, "Oh, there's this really interesting art college that I think you might be really interested in. I'm going down to the open day." And I thought, okay, great, I'll come and join you. And it just blew me away. I mean, it was in the middle of Devon, so suddenly kind of coming from inner city Birmingham to kind of being in a field, I was like, wow, you can go to university in this? Is this true? So it was, but it's very different from kind of that suburban kind of ruralness of Bromsgrove. It felt much more wild and much more kind of more potential to do wacky things. And yeah, I just really felt at home. I really felt kind of this is what I needed. I thought, having spent all this time in a city, in kind of having to live in one place, suddenly having that independence to be like, you can now go anywhere in the world potentially, but I probably wanted to stay in the UK. But I still wanted to get away from my parents and get away from Birmingham. I thought, yeah, this is where I'm going to meet the people that I'm probably going to work for the rest of my life with, the community of kind of people who want to do kind of more avant-garde things, that I felt I was starting to become more from the theatre school and from sixth form. I felt kind of definitely I was leaning towards more left field, that I thought also those places couldn't necessarily support, and I think Birmingham at the time, even though there were I was meeting lots of interesting people, there wasn't enough kind of momentum for me. There wasn't enough continuation from the interesting festivals that would happen, or the workshops that I'd go to, and I thought I just need to go away somewhere and do something really intensively for 3 years. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to go and hang out with cows in the fields. That's great. Yeah, I'm up for that. Yeah, so that's what happened.
And can you describe your experiences of university?
Yeah. So I remember it being very, again, kind of this the remoteness. I think initially, even though I was kind of nervous about, I think I really kind of relished it. I really thought, yeah, I think it's good to just be in one place with this group of people and kind of devote yourself totally to kind of making and thinking about what you're making, in terms of performance and theatre, and also kind of cross collaboration. It was interesting having people from different disciplines, from whether they were theatre makers or dancers or visual artists, and what else? Kind of having looking at the work that some of your tutors were making was really interesting, because suddenly you kind of felt more inspired to push yourself further, to kind of realise what you were doing. Yeah.
What did you study at university, and are there any memorable projects that you worked on?
So I studied something called performance writing, which was looking at kind of, well, I like to say it's looking at texting contemporary art, but it was more the relationship of text, language, meaning in kind of new ways of making performance. I say that I didn't really actually use pen and paper or write in like 3 years, because I just wanted to go to that university. I didn't necessarily want to kind of, I mean, the course was really interesting, but I wasn't one of those. I always felt, having come more from theatre and dance, I was kind of more interested in embodied ways of like using text. But the kind of social side of it, I think the people suddenly kind of living in the halls of residence was great. So the university was in an old boarding school, which was started by these two kind of philanthropists back in the 1920s, and they had this vision of education being this more kind of integrated place where children could have a choice in what they wanted to study, and they could go to different lessons. So I remember turning up at the halls of residence, and I hadn't really seen it before, and it was this old kind of kids boarding school. So the rooms were tiny, with these little tiny beds, but of course we're all 20, 21. But the fact that we kind of all, it almost felt this kind of like club nature. Each house had a different colour. So I was in Blue House. And yeah, just kind of the kind of camaraderie that comes out of people all living together, and also the mess. Just like, I don't think I set foot in that kitchen, because just no one cleaned anything for like a year. So it had its pros and cons of like, yeah, people did everything together, and it felt very communal, but at the same time it also meant people fought a lot, and people fell out, and things never quite materialised. But I thought that was kind of part of the process of kind of getting to know these people and feeling that you're spending kind of 3 years of your life with them. And yeah, I'm still friends with pretty much most of the people I've got there today. Unlike, I don't think I have any friends, and I've not kept in touch with anybody from secondary school or primary school. I think only now through kind of Facebook people are starting to emerge, but I'm still very tentative, because I felt kind of that I closed the chapter on those parts of my life. Whereas I know by going to university, I felt I wanted it to be more kind of open-ended. I wanted kind of those friendships to continue. Memorable projects. Where to start? I think probably one of the most memorable. So to give a bit of background, of the 3 years, the first 2 years were spent in Devon, and then the final year we went to Falmouth, which is in Cornwall. We knew this was happening because the school was merging with a big university, but it created a lot of kind of tension because suddenly we were moving to a new place, and I certainly tapped into a lot of my kind of migrational issues about suddenly being forced to move to somewhere else that wasn't necessarily where you. That wasn't necessarily your choice, and that you felt that you were becoming attached to. So around the end of the second year, there was lots of people work was being about this idea of what it means to migrate and to move. And my friends and I decided to do this very kind of weird opera, because we thought we'd go for a really like traditional style. But it was like promenade, so we kind of we took the audience from the centre of the school down to the river. I think because at the time the theme of the grading of the module was on rivers and kind of water and flow, because there was a river in Dartington where in Devon there was the River Fow in Falmouth, so we're trying to find this connection between these two different places, and I remember that we got really obsessed with some of the kind of the mythology of this river and the fact that it's very dangerous. It's got a very strong undercurrent, and lots of people die and drown in it. And in the graveyard of the estate where the school was, we found lots of people who had died in the river. We had, as we were always pushed to kind of do things a little bit out there, we thought the final image should be all of us attempting to drown. And so the kind of image was us kind of walking backwards into this river with this kind of very dramatic music, and then kind of trying to stay down as long as we could until we emerged, and then we kind of swam over to the other side. And I think a kind of a really powerful kind of image for the audience on one side and us on the other, and also us in the middle, trying to like not drown. So that's kind of one of kind of the really mad moments, and I kind of look to again chat with people and be like, oh yeah, remember that time you almost drowned for art? Yeah. Yeah, so that, but it's good, it's those things that kind of like bring you together and unite you, and you think, yeah, we got through that, and it's a kind of a binding thing for kind of building, I guess, community, just building friendship and moments that we can look back on.
How have your experiences of migrating impacted on your work?
Yeah, greatly. I think they have. So I think probably more so that since leaving university. I think at university it was more, I guess, thinking more about kind of personal, kind of interpersonal relations, where I think kind of leaving university I've become more interested thinking about family. I think thinking a lot about kind of the stories of my mum and my dad and their parents, my grandparents, and then thinking about kind of myself as this kind of like joining point, and so recently I made a performance about chocolate, because I thought chocolate, I feel that it is chocolate is this kind of substance that I feel kind of represents this mixture between kind of like my Mexican side and my kind of Brummie side. So I think definitely more recently it's become more visible in what I do, and less kind of just something of a lower influence. So yeah, I was very lucky to get some funding and make a theatre show, where I was cooking chocolate live on stage and talking about kind of chocolate having originated in Mexico, and my dad having learnt from his grandparents how to make chocolate, and then combining that with kind of my own personal stories of living there and coming to the UK, and one of earliest memories of going to Cadbury World, and the first part of the tour that you enter is this kind of artificial Mexican jungle with these Aztecs, and you got given a taste of chocolate, what it was like, and how much I hated it, and kind of feeling that guilt of like, but it's part of you, it's part of your culture, why you should really love this. And actually no, I really like what Cadbury's is today, and that kind of sets up the story of looking back at the past and also looking to the future. And kind of it was interesting kind of watching lots of news footage and looking at how the kind of this sense of like ownership around identity, and that kind of how the Cadbury workers today feel that chocolate is changing because of an American influence taking over the company. So it's interesting looking at my own story and looking that people have very similar stories throughout history, and they come in waves. So the kind of the journey was about this. The story of the piece was very much about these waves of takeover and choice, and sometimes choices can be quite bitter in the beginning, but sweeter at the end. So I feel like now that kind of it's very much a story about migration, very much a story about kind of what I'm telling you now, but it's told through music and video and food.
For you, how does art explore migration, and what do you want to produce in the future?
I think art definitely is a great place to talk about migration. It's not the only place to talk about migration, but it's really strong, I think, because I think why I do that a lot more with my own work now is that when I was in Birmingham doing kind of theatre with the theatre school, a lot of the stories we were using were interesting, but I couldn't directly relate to my own life. And I think I found that eventually I started to find that more and more difficult, because I thought I was kind of representing people who weren't me. And I think that's kind of when I started thinking more about, well, what if you were making your own? What if you make your own theatre, writing your own scripts, creating your own work? And that's why I decided to go to university, because I thought I needed to go to a place where that was pushed more. And I think the university I went to, they very much advocated this idea of use your own personal experience as material, as a foundation for what you want to build on. So I think from that, so all the way back from when I was 16, 15, when I started theatre school, through to now, I've kind of been building up, thinking about who am I, and how does the me relate to both my parents and their parents, and it becomes this kind of you're kind of like the centre in the ripple of a pond of a lot of other things, of history and circumstance. So yeah, I'm definitely keen to keep pushing it forwards. I guess I'm also quite keen on kind of pushing the visibility of people of Latin America here in the UK, and showing that the kind, as exotic as it seems, I think because we don't have such a kind of like a colonial Commonwealth history like other people of migration here in the UK, we still have a part to play, and it's still in, I guess I'm quite keen on trying to show that the connections aren't as remote as we might think. So something like chocolate, I think has been really useful, because it's something very, very familiar to people here in the UK, but that often the ancient history of it is not necessarily known, or is known in a very kind of simple way. So yeah, I guess I'm interested in connections. What are those? How can you take something very familiar, very everyday, something that people here in the UK from different backgrounds have a connection to, whereas if you were to I wouldn't necessarily use something that was very kind of Mexican, that people here in the UK have never felt or touched or seen or heard. So, but to take something that they do know, but then to kind of dig the earth underneath it and show that it has these roots. that lead up to the point that they're having it. So, and I guess what interested me about kind of this story about migration. Migration is a long process. It's not just the moment which you touch down, you arrive. It's everything that happens after that, and the kind of the baggage you've brought with you, and how much you're taking with you, and how much you're leaving at immigration, how much is taken away from you, immigration sometimes, and how much you spend a lot of time trying to fight to get back, because it's been in a weird room, or someone's locked it away, or someone's forgotten about it. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas for new work based on this theme?
I do, yes. So from the themes of kind of food and migration and identity, I was recently in Cornwall, which is where I studied, and I remember half hearing this story but never really following it through, or thinking it was a lie. But there's the story that Cornish miners were sent to Mexico in the 1800s to revive the silver mining trade in Mexico, and that they brought with them Cornish pasties, which there's a particular bit of Mexico where they have el paste. So I'm really fascinated by this story. And supposedly they also brought football to Mexico, which is a massive claim. And I'm a little bit unsure about that. But I think that story is really interesting, because suddenly it's almost the reverse of my stories. I'm interested in what were the stories of these miners suddenly going to the other side of the world, to a place they'd never known, but then kind of joined in that familiarity of that activity, of that employment of mining, and kind of the people. What's interesting, there's now generations of people in that part of Mexico who claim British and English ancestry. So I think I'll be fascinated by that. Who knows when that will happen? Maybe 5 years down the line, it's going to be lots of funding for that. But I guess I'm always interested in what's the migration for one person is one particular way, but also it can happen to other people in reverse. And how can you relate to this kind of, say, reverse migration? But migration is it's a two-way road, and I guess that's something that really interests me. I'm also thinking a lot about so when I left university in 2011 in Devon, I realised this was another big point in my life, and I thought, okay, where do I go now? Do I stay here? Don't particularly want to stay in Cornwall. There's not a lot of opportunity here, and I've always wanted to move to London, so I moved to London. And I've kind of been there on and off for the past 6-7 years, until now, where I'm really thinking about, do I move back to Birmingham? What is, I guess in London we talk a lot about kind of the push of gentrification. I think perhaps more so, feels more of a narrative than I feel here in Birmingham. But again, I've not lived here for a while. I think I was quite conscious to not move back to Birmingham, because I think having gone through the whole process of leaving it in the first place, I felt I don't feel ready yet to come back. So I'm thinking a lot about return, and this idea of how a returnee's accepted, or that division between kind of like the second city and the capital. And I'm interested to meet people, Londoners who've been forced to move to Birmingham because of gentrification and regeneration in the area, and looking at those kind of narratives of kind of migration is within a country rather than necessarily like international migration, because I feel there's a really interesting story there that I think is going to become more. I mean, regeneration and gentrification in London certainly isn't going to stop, and it's going to keep happening, and people are going to have to keep moving out. And I think my days there are certainly numbered. So I'm interested to find out what is this new wave of migration for a whole for that is that kind of ties, that creates a community of people. There might not be a community yet of people who felt they've come from one place, from one city, and moved to another. I'm still thinking about it. It's all very fresh and new, but I think I can definitely see the same thread of kind of migration, but from a different angle. That's kind of more infranational rather than international.
How far did you and your family go to seek community?
I think we didn't go to like any great lengths. I think what's interesting about the fact that in a way being quite kind of unique, or not necessarily having such a big demographic of a community that you can just go to. It's not like there was like an exact area that this is the Latin America. It's not like kind of Chinatown or a place where you necessarily go, but kind of word gets out that people kind of put you in touch with other people from that community. So people would say, "Oh, you're Mexican. Oh, I have this Colombian friend. You should meet this person from Colombia." So in a way, it kind of very naturally happened, which is really nice. My dad, when we moved to Balsall Heath, in Moseley, in the Moseley Triangle, there was a Mexican restaurant, and I remember he just turned up and he said, "Hey, I'm Mexican, can I have a job?" And the head chef was like, "Yeah, absolutely. When can you start?" So that was, and I think through working at that restaurant, people, I think again that relationship of food, people from Latin America would go because it'd be the closest possible way of finding that food from their country. And then I remember him saying that people would taste it and be like, this tastes really authentic. Who is your chef? And they would be like, "Oh, it's Alfredo, he's from Mexico." And then so it was interesting that we started to kind of build up this kind of community of just very distinctive individuals from around Birmingham. But it wasn't a very close community. We'd like meet every couple of months, or somebody would have a party. There wasn't the kind of lot of like binding experience to that until somebody started the Latin American Festival, which again has had a kind of like this, a lot like Birmingham, has had this kind of rocky path of being funded and not funded, of like existing and not existing, and going through having like a few years of successive happening every year, and then having like 2-3 years where nothing's happened. So that's been quite interesting. Yeah. What I also find really interesting about that is that we have it in the Arcadian in Chinatown, so it feels kind of we don't have a space yet that is ours to be able to host something like this. We have to kind of be allied to, or kind of within another migrant community that already exists. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think if it has to happen, if it can happen that way, then that's great. I think in time, I think it will become more prevalent as more people migrate.
And can you tell us more about the Latin American Festival?
Yeah. So it started by a woman called Annie. Can't remember where she's from, so I'm not going to pretend I know. I think she's Peruvian. And she's a great character. She's like very ambitious, really active. She's very much into kind of that celebration of kind of music and music and kind of craft. So there's like a craft market with the music. And I think she just has worked really, really hard to kind of keep it going, and finding it difficult because again, it's that I think trying to get money from the local council is difficult, because if the community is so small, it's hard to give money to it because you think, well, the audience is not going to be so big. But I think what kind of helps us as like Latin Americans is, I mean, obviously it can be problematic, is like when it's become more kind of fashionable and more kind of in vogue to have food from Latin America and salsa classes. So I think that's, in some way, that's kind of helped us, because it's meant that we could then use those kind of models to kind of push for the festival to become more kind of inclusive and less kind of it's something that people are certainly into, People are kind of more interested. I think also travel, thinking a lot about how very few flights there were back to Mexico when I came here. I think that has opened up a lot more, especially from Birmingham. I think there's now a direct flight to Cancun, which is near where my dad's from. And I remember that being very difficult when back in kind of the 90s, when I think there was only flights to Mexico City and they all went from London. So the journey to return to Mexico was such a long ordeal. Whereas now it's got easier, I think, because of that. It's become much more of like a go-to destination for people wanting to kind of have a holiday, which of course has its own problems in Mexico. But I think for me, as somebody of that kind of diaspora, it's really, I can see it. I can see that it's really helpful to feel kind of more connected, and for that kind of influence to mix better.
Can you describe how you think Mexico has changed since you were a child?
So when I left when I was 7 to 1996, we went back occasionally to visit grandparents, but only for a few weeks. So again, it was that kind of tourist. I entered that kind of tourist mentality of like, I'm just here to see family. I'm just here to kind of stock up on lots of food that I can't get back in England. I didn't really think more about what it meant to be Mexican at the time until I was 18, and I had my gap year, and I thought, oh, this is really, I've got a whole year. What am I going to do? And I went back to live with went to live with a family in the south bit of Mexico who I didn't really know that well for 3 months, and I think that was a really big eye-opening experience, because the way they lived was quite different to the way I lived when I lived in Mexico. I mean, yeah, again, language was an interesting thing. So suddenly, I remember turning up, and of course, I learned all this Castilian, and they were like looking at me like, "What is wrong with this person?" And I think there's a lot of, I haven't really looked into this, but there's a lot. I thought it became very humorous because a lot of the words in Castilian Spanish and Mexican Spanish have a very different meaning, often a very rude meaning. So I kept coming out with this stuff, and people would look at me, be like, "Oh gosh, okay, yeah, no, we need to change that." And I was a bit like, "What?" And then also what's interesting is that they had mixed a lot of kind of indigenous words with Spanish. So I remember hearing people talk and say, it sounds like Spanish, but it's not exactly like Spanish. Maybe it's changed since I've been away. How quickly can a language change? So that was really interesting. So it suddenly felt I was kind of re-educating myself again in that way. What was really good is that it took me about a week, 2 weeks to just get back into the flow. I know, because I use English more than I use Spanish, when I start, I'm very, very stunted. It's a bit like trying to turn on a car and it keeps stalling. But in time, it comes back really quickly, I think, because I can understand everything. It's like exercise. You know, if you don't use a language, you get very rusty and very out of shape. And so going back to Mexico, I think going back since 18, and I kind of been back a few times for kind of longer periods, not just a few weeks, to 1 month to 3 months. You start to kind of educate yourself more into kind of the political situations and learning more about just kind of the corruption of the government. That I think when you're a child, you don't know, you're not aware of that. You're kind of very much in this blissful ignorant space, and everything that feels good. So in a way, it's nice to feel you're a little bit more critical about where you're from, and rather you're not always painting it as a migrant child. The homeland isn't always this kind of beautiful childhood memory. You start to realise like, that when I was there, this was happening at that time. I didn't know that, and I think that's great. I think it's a good part about growing up. You start feeling that it's not everything's black and white. It's very much you're able to kind of reevaluate a lot of what you really took for granted somewhere and thought, oh yeah, that was because this politician was doing this. Where at the time, when you think, I guess we also look at the changes as well. I think a lot about the like cultural changes, especially in things like music. I kind of find it funny that every time I went back, people would still be listening to the same songs from, or that kind of time delay between songs that were quite like in the pop charts that were kind of quite big, like 2 to 5 years ago in the UK, was suddenly quite relevant now in Mexico. And I was a bit like, what happened? Like, what? I think maybe that's changed now, that with the internet. I think it's because of distribution and things. But I used to find it quite funny that I was a bit like, oh, this is like, I've heard this a long time ago. Why is this like top of the charts now? Yeah.
How have your trips back to Mexico influenced your creative practice?
I definitely feel there is more opportunity. It feels more for being kind of UK British to go back to Mexico, and make work about that. I feel the kind of the bridges between the two countries are stronger. Actually, yeah, 2 years ago it was what was it called? The UK Mexican Year of Connection. There was some kind of like intergovernment deal. Again, I was always too late to hear about it, but I just got involved right at the end. And there was an interesting project that somebody from Dartington, from my university, showed me, and she was like, "Oh, I've just been staying at this place, and there's this group of people where they brought artists from Mexico to the UK to look at native foods, to look at first foods, called First Food Artist Residency." And I was fascinated. I was a bit like, wow, that's a really interesting, I've never really thought about that. And she said, oh, they're going to have an open call, you should apply. So I thought, yeah, absolutely. But I was thinking like, well, what's my connection? What's the food connection between Birmingham and Mexico? And it literally took me like 2 months to figure it out. I was like, oh, of course it's chocolate. And when you kind of get those lightning bolts and you think, this is it, better late than never. So I applied and I got in, and that was great. So I went to Mexico with 3 other UK-based artists. And that was really interesting, suddenly kind of having that, it felt very odd, having that sense of kind of familiarity, but going back to Mexico. And we went to a different part of Mexico I'd never been to. And I saw a lot of connections, but also the kind of elements of being partly kind of homesick, because I felt very much I'd kind of come into the understanding the way of how to make art in the UK. So it was very different in Mexico. I think it's very kind of craft based, and kind of performance wise it's also very traditional. It's very like acting and film. So I felt kind of where I realised kind of the privilege I had of like having gone to the UK, having been in the UK, and actually the amount of support there is to be able to make what I do is very prevalent here. That isn't in Mexico. So I felt it kind of reevaluated some of the ideas I had of like, oh, maybe I'll move back. But I thought if I move back, it would be harder for me to do what I do here, there. So that was kind of quite, I kind of had already known this, but it became more apparent from doing that kind of trip. And even in small things of suddenly remember, like I'd known this, but I'd forgotten that in Mexico it's all about the phone call. People do not respond to emails, and I was there doing this really like English British thing of sending emails and waiting for responses, and nothing would happen. And then I was like, of course, yeah, I need to pick up the phone, but of course I've got huge anxieties about that because I don't like talking on the phone. Trying to arrange that, and that has that problems, because then people say things but they never actually keep their word to it. And like you've got something in a written document and you've like planned it out. So that was good because it made me reevaluate. Yeah, I've become really British in my way of bureaucracy and project management. So in a way it was just as much as it was like an interesting making creative time, it was a big learning curve to think like, yeah, I've developed a lot of these habits. Really, the way that I make things, the way that I communicate with people is very kind of informed by where I've lived and how I've been taught. So kind of a lot of that residency was me trying to like overcome that and be like, pick up the phone, just pick up the phone, go in, have a chat with somebody. So it was quite tough, but I think it was great. It was just really wonderful to have that kind of opportunity of connection, of kind of being invited to go there and make work and bring something back, rather than feel like it had to be very separate, like you have to only make work in the UK and it has to be about the UK or in English, or if you go to Mexico it has to only be in Spanish and it has to be about kind of Mexican craft. And actually seeing that connection was really was great. I'm hoping there's a future. I think there will be a future in it. I think Mexico's growing as a kind of economic power in Latin America. I think that's
How do you see your own identity?
I feel my own identity has had I mean, it's still sort of journey. I think I'm definitely at a place where I feel very kind of mixed. I definitely associate myself more with being. I'm very interested in kind of like the mixed heritage experience, and I feel more now that I'm in that middle place, in that interesting. Rather than I felt from previously in my life, I've had to be on one side. I've always had to go. If I'm in Mexico, people want me to be Mexican, or people do not see me as Mexican, they only see me as English or British. And then here in the UK, people seeing the Mexicanness, but then not, but then because of the way I speak and some kind of character traits, that you're definitely English. So it's people never been able to see you as in the middle. And I feel kind of that's why I feel now at this point in my life I'm really I'm able to kind of reconcile and be in that kind of join, in that kind of hinge between the two, and yeah. So I think kind of definitely kind of understanding kind of the being a migrant. I think especially kind of post Brexit, bring up Brexit, kind of and acknowledging the privileges I have of having this kind of British passport, of having kind of, but also the kind of contradiction of also being a migrant as well, but then still having this kind of privilege of being able to remain and being able to have that choice. Yeah, so I think I want to go into the Brummie question. Yeah, I feel that's an important point. I'd like to.
What do you think makes a Brummie?
I think I feel more proud to be a Brummie. I feel I understand it more now that I've been away from Birmingham, because I think what makes a Brummie is industrious. I think it's one thing I really noticed. I don't think I mentioned it previously about first impressions of Birmingham, was just the amount of things that were still being made in Birmingham at the time, and people's links to kind of big factories and that kind of community around industry, and even my experience of like walking around Digbeth, which obviously has gone through a lot of changes. I was really kind of connected somehow to this kind of strange kind of at sometimes both kind of like brimming with noises and smells and life, but also kind of also feeling quite desolate, and something I really liked about that. I think I spent a lot of my teenage years walking around Digbeth, and I think about that kind of mentality of making and working and being like very productive, and I think I carried that a lot with me to university. I remember a lot of that's one thing I found really frustrating about people that move to university and they suddenly they say, I've got all this money, and I'm away from my parents and suddenly being very kind of lax. And I just thought, no, this is exactly the time you need to be making all of this stuff. And I think some people just found that in me a bit affronting and a bit overwhelming. But I definitely know that's something I brought with me. And I was thinking a lot about what have I brought with me from Birmingham to this rural rural place, and I think it was definitely that wanting to keep going and to keep changing. I think it's a lot about being a Brummie. I think it's that we think a lot about. I don't think we're critical enough of the things that change and what is new to us and what we tear down and demolish. But I think I was really drawn to feeling that you, despite where you've come from or what you've done, you could, you're still able to carry that with you, but also kind of create a new, you can make it anew for yourself. And you can definitely see that in the kind of the architecture. I think I've seen Birmingham change so much from the roads and the buildings, and I think that's something I definitely take with me. Is you're pushing, your productivity pushes you to kind of take you to somewhere else, usually somewhere better. I mean, sometimes it's not always better, but you kind of hold that belief that it's this is for the best, and people's sense of kind of honesty. I think. Sincerity, I think, is what I want to say. That people in the community, particularly art communities here, because we're quite kind of connected. Like we're not necessarily a family, but I think we are kind of very extended family of people's connections to each other. And I think every time I've come back, having been in London, I really noticed that. I noticed that I can walk into an event, and I know people, and people will come and say, "Hey, how have you been? What have you been doing?" And you kind of slip back into just knowing people and catching up much quicker than you would in London, where people are too busy, and people have done 1,000,006 things, and kind of people move in and out of social circles very quickly. Whereas in Birmingham, kind of feels it takes much longer. I think sense of the time are very different in Birmingham. People have grown their communities over a much longer period of time. People are not necessarily, if people have been away, they've come back fairly soon, and that's something I really like. I like feeling that I can come back to Birmingham and that there will still be people here that I know. There's still people here that. And there are connections I can make, and kind of I can get involved in things, and kind of doors are very open, more so than in London, where it feels like there's a whole ladder to be able to get to the door to then be able to try and get yourself in. Yeah.
Thank you for telling us your story for our project. To finish off, I would like to ask you a few more questions that will help us see how we are doing with the project. Is that okay? Firstly, do you feel that telling your story has helped you feel more confident about talking with people you might not have talked with otherwise?
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think, a lot of people have migration stories, and I think because I don't really kind of talk, I think I've only quite recently started to kind of talk about it and formulate it. I think what's really great is to be able to talk about it in more depth. That isn't just saying a place where you were from, like, rather than just giving the facts. It's more to be able to think about it as a story, as a narrative, and it can have beginnings and dead ends, and you can go back and rethink about certain things and tell people the things that might not seem that relevant, but when you phrase it and you create have these series, you can actually go a little bit deeper into that story.
Secondly, how have you felt about telling your story to a young person like myself?
Good, yeah. I think it'd be interesting to kind of have done it with somebody of a different generation, but I think it certainly helped because I feel, especially having just spoken to as well, that you've got your own migration story. I think it's better to kind of build that connection there, rather than someone who perhaps is older and has perhaps been in one place for longer. I think it feels more comfortable to say that.
And finally, do you have any thoughts about how your story might help people in Birmingham when they talk about migration?
Yeah, I hope that my story can help people think about their migration from different angles rather than just it being a passage of movement. It can be related to food or culture, and also how they use their migration story to be able to make something, whether that's art or or some kind of event. I really hope that it becomes part of kind of this archive that people can access and revisit and kind of evaluate how things have changed or not changed in terms of migration patterns in Birmingham.